So we've discussed many different opportunities, risks, everything facing the global economy. I want us to take a step back and say, if I gave you a magic wand, right? You, for a day, what you say becomes law and comes into practice. So Arthur, let me start with you, and I'm going to give you a similar magic wand in a second, Laura. If you were given the proverbial magic wand, Arthur, what do you think Treasury and the SARB, and specifically in that order, can do to improve the local economic malaise?
So I think on fiscal policy, it's clear that the problem for South Africa is that while you do not have an elevated potential growth rate, you don't get enough foreign capital. So you're working with domestic savings. If government is absorbing a very high share of domestic savings for consumption, that's a problem because consumption spending does not build long-term growth. And so the more that government absorbs of savings, the less that savings is available for the private sector to invest, grow the economy. And so ultimately, fiscal consolidation sounds quite draconian in an environment like South Africa where you have these socioeconomic problems, but you have to do two things. One is lift the potential growth rate, so you've got to do these reforms and the policies that we have in place and the regulations are coming in place, but now we've got to deliver infrastructure and all these other things we talk about. But on the other hand as well, we do need to have fiscal consolidation to create the space for the private sector. If you do those two things, you're creating more space for the private sector to invest. And if you're raising the potential growth rate, obviously, then you've got more chance of attracting foreign capital, and that's to get the thing going. So, but because it's so draconian to do fiscal consolidation in this very difficult socioeconomic environment, you've got to think about it a little bit more carefully than just the usual, we cut spending and we cut, because, yeah, it's true that you don't easily get fiscal consolidation without cutting spending to GDP, and we do need to cut spending to GDP probably. But you can limit the extent of that cut in spending if you elevate your capital expenditure. Because if you elevate your capital expenditure, you raise your potential growth rate and you raise your potential long-term revenue collection as well. So for me, it's, yes, you've got to cut spending to GDP, but you don't have to be too draconian about it if you, at the same time, up your capital expenditure. Because although your total spending to GDP might not be coming down as much as you would have originally liked, your balance sheet is still quite healthy because you're building the asset side of the government's balance sheet. At the same time, you obviously, as far as tax policy goes, we can talk forever about tax policy, but you need to simplify your tax system, and you need to focus the tax system focus it more on indirect taxes and less on taxing income. And the reason that I say that is because the more that you increase your taxes on income, the less the incentive is to work, save, and invest. And so change the tax system accordingly to promote growth. Yes, cut spending, but don't be too draconian about it. Be draconian in terms of consumption spending, but lift your capex spending. And then, yeah, the Treasury has taken the very important steps of starting to address state-owned companies. I'm just concerned that Eskom is not the end of the line in terms of the problems that we get from state-owned companies. But you have to fix the financial position of the broader state-owned companies because that's the broader balance sheet, because these contingent liabilities keep coming home to roost. So that's what I would do as Treasury. As far as the SARB is, I would continue doing what I'm doing at the moment. The SARB is one part of a cog. It's one cog in a wheel, and it's done. It's a very good central bank. It's got a very clear mandate. It sticks to that mandate, and it's got high credibility. And that's all that we need and ask for from the Reserve Bank.
So you'll use your magic wand to say independence must stay there forever.
Independence. Independence in terms. I think the important thing is the mandate. The mandate is enshrined in the Constitution, so don't change the mandate. Sure. When I say that's all we need from the SARB, that's all we need on macro front. We need a lot of other things in other areas from them, and that's so for macro policy that's what I would do, but with a very keen focus on what I said on fiscal policy. I think that's critical, and we're not really doing that.
That's great. I'm gonna pass the magic wand to you, Laura. I'm gonna put you in an equally impossible situation where I give you the reins of the Federal Reserve Bank. And you have direct sway over the central banks in developed market regions as well, in that order. What would you do differently?
Ooh, that's
or similarly,
that's a great
for that
question. I mean, I think what they're doing, I think they're being quite prudent in their approach because they are being dictated by the data. I think perhaps the forward guidance that we've seen previously has been a little bit confusing in terms of market watchers and how to absorb that. What would I do? I mean, I think ultimately it's about looking at the underpinnings of inflation now. So yes, rate hikes to a certain extent can curtail demand, and that can kind of weigh on the price pressures. But ultimately, we think that there's structural changes that are emerging in a lot of developed market economies, which do suggest that inflation will be higher despite what policymakers can do. So if we think about the workforce dynamics in the US, a key trend that's emerged from the pandemic is the fact that labor force participation rates remain well below what they were pre-pandemic. And we think a lot of those workers have exited the labor force and they're not going to come back. So that is really the supply-demand dynamics that could drive wage pressures higher, that could drive inflation even higher. As well, other factors of inflation, if we think about geopolitical fragmentation, we discussed how it's quite elevated in this current environment, and it's likely going to prompt this reorientation, this rewiring of supply chains, which we think will be a series of supply-side shocks over time as well. That's going to be inflationary. And then this kind of big picture trend that's emerging on the back of the focus on energy, the need for energy security last year is around this transition to net zero and the investment that's going to be required there against this backdrop, again, where we're seeing the supply-demand imbalances in a lot of key commodities that will be crucial to that transition. So that, as well, is inflationary. So yes, central banks are tightening policy. That's really their blunt policy tool that they can pull the lever on to try to curb demand. But I think there's a supply-side story that they're not able to necessarily weigh on. And I think that's probably the key thing that's probably being missed. But again, their mandate is to keep inflation expectations anchored. So they're really kind of, their hands are tied in what they can do.
So both of you suggesting the central banks should just keep doing what they're doing. And I think that's also a good message, is that those that are pulling the strings at our central banks are doing the right thing. And I think, getting inflation in line long term matters tremendously.